Thank you very much for your kind words. It's a pleasure to be here. I mean, it's a wonderful audience and a wonderful ambience. And I'm particularly happy because I think this is the first lecture ever I gave where I feel optimistic. And you will see the reasons for that. Perhaps it's also because I'm not anymore on the court, so that could be another reason. Now, for 3 generations in a row, democracy was the natural darling in politics. And at the same time, constitutionalism was exiled to the basement of irrelevancy. But electoral majoritarian democracy has once again shown its shallowness, and it is now a hotly contested part of our political life. The celebratory mood of a shallow democracy came to a sour end, although still it is on all lips that utter incomprehensible words. It is still the darling of the people. Turks voted for President Erdogan's constitutional reforms, and we know what those reforms are, while 85% of that same population stands for democracy in perfect line with President Erdogan, who is a committed Democrat, although he also said that democracy is like a streetcar. You can jump off the streetcar before it gets to the end station. Now, many people say that this is Turkey, who cares? I fully disagree with that, but that doesn't convince those people who are of this view. And the same people say that, after all, can't happen here. Here is somewhere. And this is one of the first self-deceptions you can have today when it comes to democracy. You hear again from the same people that in the last European election, and then you go back to 2 weeks in time, democracy was saved once again, and people did not allow populists to win. What, of course, is not mentioned that those who won the elections won that on a populist ticket, just that they were successfully labeling others as being populists. So from a more theoretical perspective, what you see here is simply the exposition or explosion of the internal weaknesses and contradictions of electoral democracy, which relies upon the unmediated wish of a poorly structured people. Of course, democracy has many meanings, and among others, it is a permanent political and cultural reaffirmation of the people. So perhaps this is how people reaffirm themselves today. But this reaffirmation may not serve democracy. It may well be that people, in the name of self-rule, abandon democracy. So if you are interested in the future of democracy, and if you are interested in the future of constitutionalism, you cannot avoid this very unpleasant question. Do we like people? And of course, again, at a more analytical level, you have to ask the question, what is people? What is a people? What is the people? Who are the citizens? What is the place of constitutionalism in this conundrum? Constitutionalism and constitutional law were an institutional and cultural device that was designed to structure and inhibit people. And now, in this contemporary form of politics, it seems that politicians, manipulators in other words, prefer a political community that is not to be inhibited, and they propose people not to be inhibited. The constitutional containment of popular rule is delegitimized today, and the constitutive acts of democracy unbound people. Now, just consider one example, the efforts all over the world to abolish term limits of presidents by plebiscite. This is clearly an effort to unbound people and give back people the power to determine whatever they like. And of course, whatever they like here means to give unlimited power to someone who claims to be the savior. So there is, once again, nothing new here, there is once again a tension between electoral democracy and constitutionalism. Constitutionalism understood as the keeper of democracy. Electoral democracy has little understanding and respect to its own keeper. It's a wild horse, but wild horses, fast as they are, hardly win the Derby. Constitutionalism has hardly ever been a particularly attractive or rewarding form of thought. It was considered in academia a matter of introductory classes, a platitude at best, uncontroversial perhaps, but without specific demands on actual politics, and therefore grossly irrelevant. Separation of powers, wonderful, why not? It is nice and dandy, it legitimizes all forms of power formation, from Westminster-type cabinet dictatorship to the electoral dictatorship of presidentialism. It has no costs, so it is easy to accept and then relegate it to an introductory chapter. Fundamental and human rights were also fancy, again, as they enabled their users to claim all sorts of policies, among others, by an inflationary increase of fundamental rights, which could justify any policy. It's no surprise that constitutionalism was brought into this respect as being distrustful of people. But mistrust is not disrespect. Constitutionalism is also labeled elitist plot that deny the right of the people. The right of the people, but to what, I may ask, if I may ask. And if I may add to this, perhaps constitutionalism is suspicious of people, but it's even more suspicious of the elite, those who happen to govern. So isn't that better for people to have a suspicious keeper? I will not enter at this stage into normative justifications, I just flag this element. Now, today, constitutionalism is not simply irrelevant, but unwelcome for many. It is considered to be a tool of individual liberalism. Undeniably, constitutionalism is related and genetically related to liberalism, though a specific constitutional doctrine need not share the shortcomings of one or another specific liberal philosophy. Be as it may, constitutionalism is falling prey to a growing visceral hatred of liberalism. Liberalism was always a bad word, a schimpfword, as the Germans would say. And now it is refurbished by post-communism leaders It's refurbished by emerging semi-totalitarian regimes. And this hatred is spreading like wildfire in the West, in the prairie. Opinion makers in so-called mature democracies talk of fascist liberals. And here I quote just from last week's Daily Mail, which is, of course, the official gazette of the Central Anti-Liberal Committee. It is Katie Hopkins, famous for suggesting killing of migrants on high sea. And I just quote the title, "You are right, Theresa May. We cannot go on like this, but do you have the balls to do what's really needed and lock up the 3,000 terror suspects tomorrow?" End of quotation from the title. So, actually it's this week, not last week. So we have this talk of fascist liberals. That's where we got. And that, of course, undermines everything that is related to constitutionalism. I'm not talking here about another attack, which is that it is a tool, constitutionalism as a tool of neoliberalism, whatever neoliberalism means. But in these narratives, constitutionalism became alien or even an enemy to democracy, an elitist plot to restrain people's will and power, being part of an establishment plot of status quo maintenance, a tool of imperialism, relying on the rule of law that serves only the protection of the corrupt elite, an allegation that has an element, a grain of truth, but that's not the whole truth, and semi-truth is extremely dangerous here. Fundamental rights, also imperialistic tools intended to impose ways of life on the cultures of the majority or majorities at home and whole nations abroad, or simply they are doctrinaire obstacles to protect people from terrorists. This is not Katie Hopkins, but Theresa May 2 days ago. At the moment when the status quo became imperiled by political and cultural victories of these anti-constitutionalists, and the victory that was achieved democratically, constitutionalism once again became a matter of relevance. And not only, I think, for an elite. And again, I think if we use too much the term elite, we get into an analytical quagmire. It just doesn't help. But anyway, for simplicity's sake, I will use it. Now, let me, let me tell you what I intend to do in the remaining period, how I envision the resurrection of constitutionalism. I argue that the developments which resulted in the demise of constitutionalism were shaped by cultural changes in the political community and in the process of decision-making. And I also argue that these changes are reversible. Precautionary measures can be taken at an institutional level to make constitutionalism and therefore democracy much more resistant. There are elements in the still surviving democratic constitutional structure that can be used to reverse the current drift towards a less and less mild despotism. Such constitutional refurbishing is partly dependent on a value choice, namely a choice for European cosmopolitanism, where Europe does not simply stand for a continent of malleable borders, but for a spiritual, proto-universalist community that is unrelated to borders. And you will see, and I hope you share this, that this moment of European weakness is the moment for hope. If Europe continues this nationalistic, sovereignist disintegration, it will lose its power, attractiveness, and its own identity. And I think this is now understood, because we got too close to the edge. And so this is the moment of crisis where there is enough understanding, even among the political elite, as many quotation marks as you wish, that they are also losing, and they are also thinking with the boat. So that's the source of optimism, that finally many people, and therefore also some of the political leaders, bet on this kind of resurrection of a common project. This is a matter of cultural choice, and a cultural choice is, of course, dependent of socioeconomic adjustment, but still, it is a matter of mindset. There is a debate going on, what are the current reasons for the success of populism, and here I don't only mean populist parties, I mean populism taking over the mindset of citizens and institutions. And I think that this mindset can be changed. But in order to change the mindset, there is an intellectual task, and that is to give a convincing answer to simple questions of those who seek security and who seek security in despotism at the expense of constitutional complexities and what is called rights luxury. And I think there is an answer, because indeed this opposition of fundamental rights to security is completely wrong, and likewise it's completely wrong to believe that transnational institutions can be only non-democratic and that they do not serve the interests of individuals. But this is not a simple task, because we have to bring answers to people in a world where stupidity became a virtue in the land of the free, to quote Charles Peirce. And we are confronted with mindsets which live in a bubble, and at the moment it's not very clear how to break bubbles, although bubbles seems to be soft or even airy, but somehow the more you press, the more they resist. Now, what kind of message constitutionalism can bring to this, into this situation? Notwithstanding the self-deceiving schoolbook appeasement of democratic and constitutional theory, constitutionalism and democracy remain very strange bedfellows. After all, constitutionalism emerged as a technique to curtail people's power. If one looks at the history of the French Constitution of 1791, and I think that is the last constitution that you have to read, it becomes clear that it was it was intended to be an effort to exclude as many people as possible from the franchise. They have a complicated system of indirect elections and literacy in a hidden way. But this was quite understandable at the time, because the revolutionists were not interested in giving franchise to the servants of aristocrats, who most likely would have instructed their lackeys to vote against the revolutionaries or the revolutionary candidates. But there was a deeper conviction behind this short-term political consideration. It was the assumption of the Enlightenment regarding political deliberation. Illiterate individuals, and at that time, of course, empirical people consisted of such individuals. So these illiterate individuals without political experience were not seen fit to contribute to deliberation. By the way, a footnote, the good people of Great Britain were not prepared to decide matters in a referendum. That's the story of Brexit. You can put issues on, or have direct democracy in Switzerland where you have a tradition, where you have the institutional system. But here we had an improvisation. It was not a structured people that decided on Brexit. That's just a little footnote on the margin of the French Revolution. And by the way, this consideration that you need a specifically structured people is not something unknown to John Stuart Mill. If you wish to have a elitist liberal who was very reluctant to endorse people's power, just read Mill, who stood, like the founding fathers of the American Constitution, for representative government, not direct democracy, of course, and who relegated people's role to supervision. That's the role of people through elections. It's not even for politicians to run the country. You have the civil service to do that. So there are some rather troubling positions in the history of constitutionalism if you take a radical populist democratic perspective. But I don't think that this is decisive. This is not enough to say that democracy does not need restrictions. And restrictions here mean restrictions upon the people, which in principle shall be self-imposed restrictions. That's the beauty of the beast. It's not something imposed. It is these constitutional restrictions were accepted by people. Because I think that people at the moment of constituting itself realized that their deliberative power is limited. Not because they are stupid, but because human deliberation in interaction is open to all sorts of mistakes and faults. So in a way, there is a constitutional heuristics at play here. It is, once again, a matter of rational and reasonable self-restriction of the people we are talking about. It's not something imposed. Even if at the moment of elections and specific pieces of legislation, individuals constituting the majority of the day may feel that this is a restriction. But it is, I think, terribly wrong to confuse the majority of the moment with constitutive people. And that, I think, is this speaks for constitutionalism. Now, I would like to skip how democracy came to power in Europe and elsewhere, but I would like to say that notwithstanding this uncontested and perhaps too comfortable position of democracy in contemporary world as a tool of regime justification, as I say, constitutionalism is necessary for a sustainable democracy. Otherwise, it becomes electoral democracy, which can be hijacked by self-perpetuating interest groups. Having said that, we still have the problem of the empirical people. Those who believe that the outcome of a vote on a single agenda or giving a ticket to a political group is the same as the will of the people. In a way, we are living in a world where radical Rousseauist ideas became part of political demagoguery. Okay, so I have a problem with the actual momentary majorities. You will say, that's my own problem. Who cares? But and you will say, the reality is that you cannot have constitutionalism without constitutionally committed people, just like you cannot have democracy without Democrats. And given that constitutionalism smacks of elitism, you will never have that people. So it will remain always an isolated conspiracy. If I have a problem with people, I am in the position that was described in a famous piece of poetry by Bertolt Brecht, The Solution. That's a piece he wrote after to the great surprise of the then GDR Communist Party leaders, workers stood up in 1953 against the communist regime. And that was considered to be, by the communist leaders, as a betrayal of the cause of communists. So this is what he wrote in The Solution. After the uprising of the 17th June, the secretary of the Writers' Union had leaflets distributed in the Stalin Allee stating that the people had forfeited the confidence of the government and could win it back only by redoubled efforts. Would it not be easier in that case for government to dissolve the people and elect another? So I don't want to get to this position, but I think democracy, as I told you, is a constant redefinition of the people. So perhaps instead of dissolving people by the government, people shall dissolve itself and reconstitute itself. And that is what politics is about, constant reconstitution of the people. That's democracy, what democracy is about. It's an opportunity for reconstitution. Of course, constitutions are a bigger reconstitution than ordinary legislation. What are the possibilities for such reconstitution? And here I have to go through a list of very unpleasant things. First, which indicate that this is a very difficult task. And in many respects, there are difficulties with a reinvigoration of constitutionalism, in a certain way also for democracy, robust Republican democracy. So what are those cultural factors which play a negative role here? What are those mental features which cause hardship to constitutionalism and animate populism? People today in Europe and many other parts of the world live in a culture of narcissistic individualism. The exhibitionism, and just think about how much time people spend on showing pictures together with Mona Lisa on social media. It's a good company, no problem. But instead of looking at Mona Lisa, you look at the moment when you can use your selfie. So this kind of exhibitionism is preparing a specific emotionalism. And emotionalism is not good for, it's inevitable. But it is not very helpful for deliberative processes. It is in this context that you have to understand why politics becomes a game of grievance claims. Grievances are replacing arguments. You are not liked enough, so you are humiliated. If you are humiliated, you are ready to express your views as a matter of resentment. And resentment is now becoming a fundamental mover in democratic politics. Again, it is not what traditional constitutional democracy was about. You cannot have a resentment-based politics if you wish a system that is giving answers to real questions. Resentment is not about genuine problems. It's a narcissistic distortion of genuine and even more imaginary problems. But it is resentment that animates contemporary political programs. Now, the second element of this narcissistic culture is also very well known, or the consequence is very well known in democratic electoral politics. It is a replacement of interest politics with identity politics. Again, in identity politics, where identity, and once again, resentment-based identity, is the mobilizing factor, the traditional deliberative discourse is imperiled. And I use this word as an understatement. So we have a shift towards identity politics. And again, this is a hotbed for emotionalism. Or you can reverse it and you can say because the culture prepared for emotionalism, identity politics became extremely powerful. What are the consequences on constitutionalism? These are comparable to the consequences of a very different syndrome of the 1920s. Parliamentary deliberation, the role of parliament, was seen as irrelevant, soap talk, not representing the people, not even representing a special interest, because everything was behind it. It was just an instrument that became completely irrelevant. It was not very difficult to live without the Reichstag in Germany after it was burned down or after Hitler took power over, because already Reichstag, the German parliament, was not effective. And that's another consequence of the contemporary development. Now, where identity is the organizing principle, it is increasingly more and more difficult to cope with socio-cultural diversity in a world where socio-cultural diversity is increasing. Now, in these circumstances, the identity of the other is a threat to your identity. This is like in a zero-sum game. And therefore, given the threats to identity, people move to something that sounds old-style constitutional theory. They move back to birthright. What is so attractive in birthright? We are what we are because we were born into. We are what we are because we were born into. So this is a birthright claim, which of course is wonderful because you can get it without effort. It's easy to get. And it is attractive because you can use against all those who were not born into this. And of course, this is first a matter of natural of nature. Some people are not born in the community, but then it becomes a matter of qualification. Not that the first one is not bad enough. It becomes a matter of who have the birthright, those who come from the heartland. So it's not enough to be born, you have to be born with the right mindset, with the right, into the right tradition, because only that what gives you birthright. It has to be the heartland. So here we have a major challenge to constitutionalism that is based on a commonality. And now, the next step is nation state and sovereignty. Politicians exculpate themselves by blaming external forces. And therefore, it's understandable that they prefer unbound national sovereignty as a political constitutional doctrine. I have to accept that constitutionalism originally was a very narrow nationalist project. In the US, it was about building a union, creating a new state. Again, even in 18th century France, it had a nation stabilizing element, or it was a project of that nature. So constitutions are about state consolidation, no question about that. But this is a historical mission at a given historical moment. It's not necessarily true that constitutional protection is anchored in the nation state. Indeed, and that's where the hope comes from, the constitutional systems we have terrible weak spots, shortcomings. The constitutional projects, partly because they were just considered not to be important or indeed being a hassle for politicians, were not fully developed. And to some extent, the internationalization was undoing these shortcomings. Where domestic constitutional courts or domestic courts failed, there was a hope that international courts, which are not bound by the same localism and one-sidedness, can undo these difficulties. Where the executive was dominating in violation of checks and balances without proper accountability, it was again hoped, and this is not a hope without reason, that an international body can do a better job, because the international body will not be bound by the same interests. Maybe it will be bound by other interests. I'm not idealizing this. But there, again, in terms of checks and balances, there can be a new element of checks and balances. So there is a new international constraint on the domestic national constitutional structure. It's an addition, not a diminution of checks and balances. That was the hope, and I think this is still the hope. But this is very much against the idea of those who would like to return to nation-state constitutions and national sovereignty, and indeed they bypass very often the constitution element, and it is national sovereignty where the emphasis on sovereignty, meaning something unlimited. Again, constitutionalism is not for something unlimited. So there is a danger that by returning to national sovereignty, you return to some kind of absolutism. I would perhaps not enter into the way rights fundamental rights in particular are in conflict with majority preferences. And here I only would like to use this moment. I think it's high time for a commercial break. So I would like to, this is not to turn the machine off. The commercial break is about self-advertisement, of course. I have to give another lecture in a week's time. Professor Halmai organized a colloquium or conference where I am supposed to speak about dignity and the demise of constitutionalism. So this part, if you are interested, you will hear in a week's time. I will not go into this, but there is a element in fundamental rights which are liberty-oriented in their origin, which goes against the certain concepts of dignity, and dignity is the idea that is taken up by this narcissistic attitude that goes into identity politics. So here again, identity politics supported by a misunderstanding of human dignity and rights based on dignity may undermine constitutionalism as we know. I would like also to skip my defense of constitutionalism as a friend of democracy. I suppose that in this group, in this among colleagues, the normative arguments in favor of constitutionalism as a friend of democracy are not particularly necessary to be mentioned. Personally, I see constitutionalism being important to democracy because otherwise democracy is not structured. But I also see that democracy is part of constitutionalism. It is like the people expressing its will, creating various separate bodies of government, is exercising a control over those institutions, and it is, in a way, another branch of power which influences the others. So it contributes to checks and balances. I don't want to sound like Leo Strauss, who said that I am a friend of democracy, but friendship means that you have to criticize your friends. So I'm not going into criticism of shortcomings, but I think that indeed unruly democracy and unruly people's power do not do good to the democratic political order. So, having said all these unpleasant things, where my optimism comes from, and I mentioned already one source, and the source is the recognition of the European paralysis in politics and everyday life. I think that there is a moment for saving democracy and saving people by moving away from nation-state democracy, and international organizations may, and other formations may become major ingredients in a constitutionalist mixture, undoing the shortcomings of national constitutions. Of course, and I think this is a platitude, this means overcoming the current muddling through approach. It means that the current system that we know, for example, in the European Union, did not contribute to enhance democracy. It was, in many respects, just a way to increase the power of national executives without accountability. So this has to be finished. This cannot continue. If this is what is going to continue, it will not be accepted and it will not be effective. And efficiency matters. But I think that this can be overcome. Why I think that people will understand this, and why some politicians understand this, because I think people have to understand that Europe, and here I mean also a spiritual Europe, not just a bunch of commercially interrelated nations and citizens, that Europe will lose big in the international competition. And what I mean by why is this? Why this should be clear? Well, here I just would like to mention what it would mean for Europe to be losers. I suppose there must be someone here from Greece, and I hope that if someone is here from Greece, will corroborate what I'm going to quote. This is a short quote from someone who lived in or worked in the Chinese-operated part of the port of Piraeus. And the other half of the port of Piraeus, which is still a worker's paradise, is idle. There are no ships there, but it's fully controlled by the workers. Now, the other part was taken over by the Chinese. It's blooming, it's flourishing, it's wonderful from a business perspective. There is a small price. Let me quote Costco, that's the Chinese company. Costco's Piraeus facilities are notorious for their sweet shop working conditions, with accidents being a common occurrence. In 2011, a worker interviewed by US radio, National Public Radio, explained, here is what he said: workers were told by supervisors to urinate into the sea rather than taking toilet breaks. Now, I think people, that's the end of the quote, and I apologize for the literal quote, but I think that people dare to think for themselves, and people shall think for themselves as Europeans. And to use this very down-to-earth or down-to-sea quote, I think that people shall think even at the level of bodily functions, because this is really what is at stake to some extent. People, if Europe and the states in Europe will become losers, dependencies of Chinese investors and tourists, Russian gas, and local forces serving those interests. This is something that is easy to understand, and I think this will play a certain role. But the second source of my optimism is a technical one. I mentioned that constitutionalism was an unfinished project. It was not taken sufficiently seriously. And I think it has the technical potential for becoming a saving grace. I'm not arguing that law can do wonders, only wonderfully strong blunder that can be done by law. But still, institutions do matter, and one should mobilize those institutions. So one can take constitutionalism seriously. Let me give you an example. Take the recurrent use of constitutional amendments or writing new constitutions as a foundation of new illiberal democracies. It's mostly constitutional, from Chavez to European countries I'm not supposed to name. If you have a different, and this is done either by parliamentary majority or, again, in Latin America, by plebiscite. If you have the Norwegian-Dutch constitutional amendment system, this can't happen, because in those systems, or in that model, first parliament introduces the amendment, then it has to be dissolved. So there is a fundamental risk. And then there is a period of grace, if you wish, new elections. Not even the first day of the new parliament you can vote a second time for the amendment. So there are techniques, and I just mentioned this is most spectacular because we know that having this system, you can't have Chavez. You should have had a fundamentally revolutionary constitution. Their constitutionalists can't have, but that is where people come in. So leave that aside. Revolution, that's not for constitutionalists, that's for the people. But within constitution, there are techniques. You can structure procedures and deliberations. You can take this into account and take it seriously. And, you know, in the literature, you find recently extremely intelligent writing on constitutions and constitutional provisions shall be, it's Napoleon's idea, ironically, shall be as obscure as possible and as little constitutional stuff you need in order to have the rule of law. It's strange, but that is something that you hear. You don't need any more constitutional courts because they deprive people of democracy. That is, I think, what we should not accept. These are exactly the institutions that have to be invigorated. You may say that this is an idea of a formalistic lawyer who believes that law and institutions matter. We have no other choice. We have no other choice. We have to structure. And this seems at the moment the way to structure. Of course, where culture was good enough to maintain a certain decency, like it was the case many, many years ago in the United Kingdom. And here I quote someone. There was not a problem. Once that culture collapsed, once it was not taken for granted that you call to elections if you have a new agenda, as it was obvious to Gladstone when the Home Rule, he wanted to introduce Home Rule, immediately dissolved Parliament, went to the country. Failed, resigned. That's not the culture today. So where there is no culture, you need institutions. And I don't see that culture to be present. So you need to go back to institutions. You could have neglected those institutions, hoping that there will be culture or that people will be robustly committed to Republican democracy. It did not materialize. So you have to go back in the interest of democracy to those institutions. And believe me, just think about my example, institutions can work. Let me add as a footnote that, of course, most of what is occurring in undermining democracies is not at the constitutional level. It's at the administrative law level. But still, administrative law can be, to some extent, controlled and influenced by constitutional considerations. So, let me come to the conclusion. At this moment, I see that there is a piece of paper you can write a new constitution on. We know the words and the letters for that constitution. At least we know the alphabet. Our role is to use that alphabet to write reasonable sentences and hope that someone will read those sentences. And who has to read those sentences? The same people who are supposed to write it. Anyway, this is the only way to remain Europeans. There is an alternative. You can abandon Europe. You can get accustomed to the daily image of 300 bodies floating on a pristine blue Mediterranean seawater. But I think that at this moment, people are still capable of understanding what acquiescence to those pictures mean for their own, if you wish, identity. It's not the beginning of a different identity politics. But this is what we are confronted with. And it's not too late. And I said many nasty things about people, or a people, or the people, or of citizens. But I think that people in Europe and elsewhere do not wish to accept 300 bodies floating. And that's what Europe as a spiritual endeavor stands for, not to accept it. So I think from desperation shall come hope. And I think that one cannot end without hope. So thank you for your hopes.